I used to believe that loyalty was something you proved once, and after that, people just knew it about you forever. I was wrong. I learned that loyalty has to be proven again and again, in small moments nobody else is watching, and that the people who fail those small tests are usually the same people who fail the big ones. I didn't understand that until I was 56 years old, standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, holding my mother's hand while she apologized to me for being a burden. That's the night everything I thought I knew about my marriage came apart quietly, without a single raised voice. My name is Nathan Pierce. Everyone calls me Nate. I want to tell you what happened to my family because I think somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that the quiet ones, the ones who never yell, who just show up and do the work, they're the ones who end up all right in the end. I live in Millbrook, a small town about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. I've lived there my whole life except for 4 years in the Navy in my 20s. I run a small carpentry business, mostly custom cabinetry and built-in furniture for houses in the area. It's steady work. Not flashy, but it's honest, and I've always liked that a man could look at something I built and know exactly how long it would last because I put my name on it. I was married to a woman named Renee for 22 years. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 32. She was sharp, funny in a dry way, ambitious about her career in a way I found admirable back then. We built a life together. Not a perfect one, no marriages, but a life I thought was solid. We didn't have children, which was its own kind of grief for both of us at different points, but we had each other, or so I believed. My mother's name is Alina. Everybody calls her Ellie. She's 81 years old and she taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for 34 years. She raised my sister and me on a teacher's salary after my father passed when I was 11, and she never once made us feel like we were short on anything, even though I know now we were. She worked summers cleaning houses so we could have new shoes in September. She never told anyone that. I only found out years later from a neighbor. My mother is the kind of woman who apologizes for asking you to help her carry in groceries. She still sends birthday cards with $2 bills tucked inside, the way she did when I was 9. She lives alone in the house I grew up in, 4 streets over from where Renee and I live, a small blue house with a porch swing my father built before I was born. I go by most Sundays. Sometimes I fix something. Sometimes we just sit and she tells me about her garden. There's a memory I come back to often. I was maybe 7 years old, and I had the flu bad enough that my mother took 2 unpaid days off from a cleaning job she couldn't really afford to miss. She sat in a kitchen chair pulled up next to my bed all night, pressing a cool washcloth to my forehead, humming some old hymn under her breath, so quietly I don't think she knew she was doing it. In the morning, she went to work anyway because the bills didn't care that she was tired. That's the kind of person she is. She gives until there's nothing obvious left to give, and then she finds a little more. She never remarried after my father died. There were men who asked over the years, I remember at least 2, a widower from her church and a man named Frank who ran the hardware store downtown. She always said the same thing when I asked her about it. I already used up my one great love, Danny. I'm not looking to replace it. I'm just looking to finish raising you and your sister the best I know how. My sister, Patricia, moved out to Denver for work back in the 90s and calls every Sunday. But the day-to-day of caring for our mother has always fallen mostly to me, and I've never resented that. If anything, I've considered it one of the great privileges of my life. I'm telling you all of this because you need to understand what she means to me before I tell you what happened on the morning of March the 14th. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are when I do the books for the business, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside the laptop. My phone rang at 7:42 in the morning. It was my mother's neighbor, a woman named Carol Ann Prout, who has lived across the street from her for almost 20 years. "Dan, honey, I think you need to come over here," Carol Ann said. Her voice had that particular calm that people use when they're trying very hard not to sound frightened. "Your mama's on the porch. She said she doesn't feel right. I think we need to call an ambulance, but she's asking for you first." I was out the door before Carol Ann finished the sentence. My truck, though, was at the shop, up on the lift with a blown alternator that Ricky, the kid who works for me part-time, was supposed to have fixed the day before. I stood in my driveway for a full 3 seconds that felt like 3 minutes, and then I ran back inside. Renee was in the bathroom getting ready for work. She managed the regional office for an insurance company, a job she took great pride in, and rightfully so, she'd worked hard for it. I knocked on the door. "Renee, I need the car. It's my mom. Carol Ann says something's wrong. She's on the porch. I need to get over there right now." There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it even in that moment. "I have the Hendricks presentation at 9, she said through the door. "I can't be without a car today, Dan. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me, even now. I want to tell you that maybe she didn't understand the urgency. Maybe she thought I was overreacting, the way husbands sometimes do about their mothers. So I said it again, plainer. She might be having a heart attack, Renee. I need the car." The door opened. She was in her blazer already, one earring in, the other in her hand. She looked at me, not with panic, not even with much interest, the way you might look at someone who's told you the dry cleaning isn't ready yet. "Can't Carol Ann just drive her? Or call an ambulance? I really cannot miss this presentation, Dan. We've been prepping for weeks." I didn't answer her. I couldn't, honestly. Something in my chest went very still and very cold, and I turned around and went back outside, already dialing 911 with shaking hands, already running down the sidewalk toward my mother's house on foot because 4 streets suddenly felt like 40 miles. Walt Kowalczyk lives 2 doors down from us. He's 63, retired from the county road department, and he was out front trimming his hedges when he saw me running. He didn't ask a single question. He just dropped the clippers in the grass, grabbed his keys off the hook inside his door, and had his truck running before I'd even reached the end of his driveway. "Get in, Dan. Where are we going?" That's it. That's all he said. No hesitation, no calculating what it would cost him, no mental math about his own schedule. I've thought about that moment 100 times since. A neighbor I occasionally waved to on trash day did in 4 seconds what my wife of 22 years couldn't do in 20. We got to my mother's house right as the ambulance pulled up. She was sitting on the porch swing, gray in the face, one hand pressed flat against her chest, and Carol Ann was crouched beside her holding her other hand and talking to her in a low, steady voice, the kind you'd use to calm a spooked animal. "There's my boy," my mother said when she saw me, and she tried to smile, and that smile is the thing that broke me more than anything else that whole day. Even scared, even in pain, she was trying to make me feel better. The paramedics were good, quick, calm, professional. They got her on oxygen, ran a strip that showed something they didn't love the look of, and had her in the ambulance within minutes. I rode with her. Walt followed behind in his truck without being asked to, and sat in that waiting room with me for 6 hours before I finally told him to go home and get some rest, that I'd call him with updates. Millbrook Community isn't a huge hospital, but it's a good one, and the cardiac team there took my mother seriously the second she came through the doors. A doctor named Patricia Nwasu came out to talk to me around midday. She had the kind of face that made you trust her immediately, steady eyes, no wasted words. "Your mother had a cardiac event," she told me. "Not a full heart attack, but close enough that we're not taking any chances. We're keeping her at least 48 hours for observation. She's stable right now, and honestly, Mr. Kessler, the fact that she got here quickly probably made a real difference." Quickly, that word sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of the day, because I knew how close we'd come to it not being quickly at all. The waiting room on the 2nd floor had the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look a little bit sick, and a coffee machine that only dispensed something the color of dishwater. I drank 3 cups of it anyway, because it gave my hands something to do. A nurse named Denise, the same one who'd end up on my mother's floor that evening, came through around 1 o'clock to update me, and she must have clocked something in my face, because she paused instead of just rattling off vitals. "First time going through something like this with a parent?" she asked. "First real scare, yeah. It gets easier to sit with, not easier to go through," she said, not unkindly. "Your mama's a fighter, though. She was cracking jokes with the tech during her EKG. Told him his hands were colder than a Millbrook winter." That made me laugh, the first real laugh of the day, and it loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since Carol Ann's phone call that morning. I spent a good part of that afternoon just watching people move through that hallway, families arriving with the same stunned, hurried look I'd probably had on my own face a few hours earlier. A janitor working his mop in slow, patient circles. An older man asleep upright in a chair with a Bible open on his lap. Hospitals have a way of stripping everything down to what actually matters. Nobody in that waiting room cared what car anyone drove or what meeting anyone was missing. They only cared whether the person they loved was going to be all right. I called Renee twice that afternoon. The first call went to voicemail. The second time she picked up and I could hear the hum of the office behind her. "How'd the presentation go?" I asked her, and I want to be honest, there was an edge in my voice I couldn't hide. "It went well, actually. How's your mom?" "Your mom, not how is she? Not is she going to be okay? Your mom, like a mild inconvenience that belonged to me and me alone. They're keeping her 2 days. It was a cardiac event." "Oh no, that's awful. Do you need me to bring you anything?" I told her no. I told her I was fine, that Carol Ann had brought me a sandwich, that I'd be home late. She said okay, sounded relieved almost, and told me she had a client dinner that evening she really couldn't skip. I sat in a hard plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and I let that phone call settle into me the way cold settles into a house with a bad furnace, slow, and then all at once. My mother was moved to a room on the third floor that evening. I sat with her while a nurse named Denise checked her vitals every hour. Around 9 that night, my mother reached over and patted my hand. "You didn't have to stay all day, Danny," she said. She still calls me Danny sometimes when it's just the two of us. "I know you've got a business to run." "There's no place else I'd be, Mama." She was quiet a moment, watching the monitor blink its steady green rhythm. "Where's Renee?" "She had a work thing." My mother didn't say anything to that. She didn't have to. She just gave the smallest nod, the kind of nod that carries decades of quiet observation behind it, and looked back at the ceiling. I realized, sitting there, that my mother already knew something about my marriage that I had spent years refusing to see clearly myself. "Do you remember," she said after a while, "when you were 19 and you wrecked your father's old truck out on Route 9? "I remembers. You called me from a payphone at midnight, scared to death, thinking I'd be furious. And I drove out there in my nightgown with a coat thrown over it because you were my son and it didn't occur to me to think about anything else." She turned her head toward me. "That's what family does, Danny. It's not complicated. It's just showing up." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in that vinyl chair with the stiff armrests, and I let my mind walk back through 22 years of marriage, and I started noticing a pattern I'd been too close to see before. The 4th of July, 6 years back, when my mother slipped on wet grass at our family cookout and sprained her wrist. Renee had gone inside to refresh her wine and missed the whole thing, and when she came back out, she'd said, lightly, "Oh, Ellie, you have to be more careful at your age," like it was a scheduling inconvenience rather than an injury. The winter my mother's furnace went out and she spent 2 nights in a cold house because she didn't want to bother anyone. When I found out and told Renee I was going to spend the weekend fixing it, she'd sighed and said, "Your mother needs to think about assisted living, Dan. This is getting to be a lot." The birthday dinners where Renee would check her watch. The Christmas mornings my mother came to our house, and Renee would disappear into the kitchen for suspiciously long stretches. I thought, too, about the spring my mother had her cataract surgery 3 years back. She'd needed rides to and from 3 separate appointments over 2 weeks, plus a full day where she wasn't supposed to be alone in case of complications. I'd rearranged my whole work schedule around it without a second thought, and I remembered Renee mentioning, almost offhand, over dinner one of those nights, that maybe it would be simpler if my mother just used one of those medical transport services, so it doesn't eat up so much of your week. At the time, I'd taken it as a practical suggestion. Sitting in that hospital chair months later, I understood it for what it actually was, a quiet request to outsource my own mother's care so it would stop being an inconvenience to our schedule. None of it on its own had seemed like betrayal. Each one had seemed small enough to excuse, explainable by a bad day or a busy season. But sitting in that hospital chair, watching my mother's chest rise and fall under a thin white blanket. The pattern stopped looking like a string of small moments and started looking like exactly what it was: 22 years of quiet, consistent disregard, disguised as busyness. I wasn't angry yet. Not that night. That night I was just awake, in the way you're awake when your eyes have finally adjusted to a dark room and you can suddenly see the furniture you'd been walking into for years. My mother came home 3 days later with a stack of prescriptions and strict instructions to take it easy. I stayed with her the first week, sleeping on the pull-out couch in her den. Renee stopped by exactly once, brought a bouquet of grocery store flowers, stayed for 11 minutes, and left saying she had a headache. About 2 weeks after she was discharged, my mother called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I could drive her downtown. "I've got an appointment," she said. "Nothing to worry about, just some paperwork I need to sort out." I picked her up at 11. She was dressed the way she used to dress for parent-teacher conferences, sharp navy blazer, hair set just right, and she had me drive her to a small brick office building on 4th Street with a sign out front that read Voss and Marchetti, attorneys at law. "Mama, what's going on?" "I'm just handling some business, Danny. A woman my age needs her affairs in order. Wait out here if you like, or come on in, I don't mind either way." I went in with her. Harold Voss turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who greeted my mother like an old friend, because it turned out he'd handled her will for over a decade. He offered to have me step out for privacy, and my mother waved a hand. "He can stay. There's nothing in here Dan doesn't already deserve to hear." What followed wasn't dramatic. My mother didn't rage about Renee. She didn't say a single unkind word about her. She simply calmly told Harold Voss that she wanted to update her estate documents. She wanted the house left to me outright, along with her modest savings and the small parcel of land my father had left her outside of town. And she wanted it made explicit in writing that none of it was to pass to a spouse by marriage under any circumstance, present or future. "Ellie," Harold said gently, "can I ask what's prompted this? Your last documents left everything to Dan with the standard provisions." My mother folded her hands in her lap, the same way she used to when she was about to explain something to a room of 8-year-olds who needed to hear it clearly and only once. "Harold, I've watched who shows up in this life and who doesn't. I raised my son to be a man who shows up, no matter the cost to himself. I'd like to make sure that when I'm gone, what I have goes to people who understand what that's worth. That's all. It's not about punishing anyone. It's about being honest, finally, about what I've seen." Harold nodded slowly, and he told me later, once my mother had stepped out to use the restroom, that in his 30 years of practicing law he had rarely seen a client speak with that kind of clear-eyed dignity. "No bitterness in her at all," he said. "Just clarity. That's rarer than you'd think." He pulled out a legal pad and started making notes while my mother sat with her hands folded, watching a hummingbird feeder swinging outside his office window like she had all the time in the world. "Ellie, I want to make sure I understand fully," he said. "You want the house on Larkspur, the Route 4 parcel, and your investment accounts to pass entirely to Dan, with a clause explicitly excluding any spouse he may have at the time of your passing, current or future, from any claim on those assets." "Is that right?" "That's right. And if Dan should divorce or remarry down the line, none of that changes your intent." "None of it," my mother said. "I'm not doing this out of spite, Harold. I want that written somewhere too, if it can be. I don't wish Renee any harm. I hope she has a good life. I just don't intend to reward absence with inheritance, not when I've spent my whole life watching what real presence costs a person and what it's worth." Harold looked at me for a moment, like he wanted to gauge whether I needed a moment before he continued, but I just nodded for him to go on. There was something almost peaceful about sitting in that office and hearing my mother lay it all out so plainly. It didn't feel like watching someone plot against another person. It felt like watching someone finally stop pretending. "There's one more thing," my mother added, almost as an afterthought, though I don't think anything my mother says is ever really an afterthought. "I'd like a letter kept with the file. Not part of the legal documents themselves, just something for Dan to read someday whenever he needs it. Is that something you can hold on to for me, Harold?" Of course, Ellie, I can do that. She wrote it right there in his office, on a sheet of his letterhead, in that careful, looping cursive she'd taught 3 decades of third graders to imitate. I didn't read it that day. I didn't read it for almost a year, actually, not until the divorce was finalized and I finally asked Harold for it. When I did read it, alone in my truck outside his office, it undid me in a way the whole ordeal with Renee never quite had. It said, in part, that she was proud of the man I'd become, that showing up for people wasn't a burden I should ever apologize for carrying, and that whatever happened with my marriage, she needed me to know I had never, not once in 56 years, been the disappointment in that house on Larkspur Street. I sat in that truck for a long while before I could drive home. I didn't tell Renee about the appointment, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I honestly didn't know yet what I wanted to do with what I was seeing so plainly for the first time. I went home that night and sat across from my wife at our kitchen table while she talked about a new client account she'd landed, and I found myself studying her the way you'd study a stranger, trying to remember why I had loved her so completely for so long, and finding that I still could remember, and that the memory hurt more than anger would have. Life went on the surface for another month or so. My mother recovered well. Her color came back, her energy came back. She started puttering in her garden again the way she always had. I visited her every few days. Renee and I existed in the same house the way two people do when a marriage has quietly ended before either party has said so out loud. The truth came out on a Saturday morning in May. My mother had passed away. No, I need to correct myself because I got ahead of my own story there for a moment, and I want to tell this honestly. My mother did not pass away. She is alive and well today, and I want that understood clearly because this isn't a story about losing her. It's a story about almost losing her and what that almost taught me. The truth came out because Renee, going through old mail one Saturday, found a letter from Harold Voss's office confirming the updated estate documents, a copy that had been sent to me, and that I'd left, carelessly or maybe not so carelessly, on the front hall table. She read it standing in the kitchen. I watched her face change as she went line by line. When she looked up at me, her expression wasn't grief, and it wasn't even really shock. It was something closer to disbelief that this particular consequence had actually arrived, as though she'd always assumed there was a version of this life where she could treat my family as optional and never once have to pay for it. She cut me out, Renee said. She didn't cut you out of anything, Renee. Everything my mother has was always going to go to me. This just makes sure it stays that way, no matter what happens to us. No matter what happens to us, Renee repeated, and something in her voice sharpened. Is that a threat? It's not a threat, it's the truth. I've spent 2 months thinking about what happened the morning she got sick. I've thought about a lot of mornings before that one too, and I keep landing in the same place, Renee. You had a choice that day and you made it calmly without a second thought, and I don't think you even remember it as a big moment. That's what scares me most. It wasn't cruelty, it was just nothing. She wasn't even a consideration. I had a presentation, Dan. People don't drop everything every single time. She might have been dying, I said, quiet, not raising my voice at all because I found I didn't need to. And you asked me if Carol Ann could drive her instead so you wouldn't be late. The kitchen went very quiet. Renee opened her mouth once, then closed it. I think, for the first time in a long while, she understood that there wasn't a version of this conversation where the right words would fix it, because it wasn't really about that one morning anymore. It was about every morning that had come before it, all of them stacking quietly on top of each other until they became a truth neither of us could pretend not to see. We didn't have a screaming match. That's not who I am, and honestly, by that point, it isn't who Renee was either. The anger had already burned off into something flatter and more exhausted. We talked off and on over the following weeks. She asked more than once if there was anything she could do to fix things, to make it right with my mother, to earn her way back into those documents. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I didn't think that was really the point anymore. One evening, near the end of it, she asked me a question that stayed with me. Did you ever love me, Dan, or was I always just something you were waiting to see fail? I understood why she asked it, but it still stung because it wasn't true, and I think some part of her knew that even as she said it. I loved you for a long time, Renee. I probably still do, somewhere underneath all this. But loving someone was never supposed to mean pretending I didn't see what I was seeing. I spent years doing exactly that, making excuses on your behalf so I wouldn't have to face what it meant about us. My mother almost died on a Tuesday morning, and you asked me if the neighbor could handle it instead. I can forgive a lot of things. I don't know that I can forgive not being seen as urgent, not once, not ever, when it came to the people I love most. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one to give. It was never really about the money, Renee. Mama's never had much money to begin with. It was about the fact that you had 22 years and countless chances to show up for the people I love, and you kept choosing not to, and I kept finding reasons to excuse it. I think I'm done finding reasons. I moved out in June, into a small rental 2 streets from my mother's house, close enough that I can walk over most evenings after work. It's a modest place, 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a back porch I've already started fixing up on weekends because old habits die hard. The first night I slept there, I remember lying in an unfamiliar room, listening to unfamiliar sounds, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was relief. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Just the particular relief of finally not having to pretend anymore. The divorce was finalized that November. It was, in the end, quiet and businesslike, the same way most of our marriage's final year had been. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no raised voices, no slammed doors. Just 2 people signing papers that acknowledged what had already been true for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Renee kept the house we'd shared. I didn't fight her on it, and I didn't want to. It never felt like mine anyway. Not really, not in the way that little rental 2 streets from my mother somehow did within the first month. We ran into each other once at the grocery store on Route 9, a few months after everything was finalized. It was brief and civil. She asked how my mother was doing. I told her she was doing well, that her dahlias had come in beautiful this year. Renee nodded, and there was a flicker of something in her face, regret, maybe, or just the particular sadness of understanding a thing too late to do anything about it. And then she said she hoped I was doing all right, and I told her I was, and we went our separate ways down the cereal aisle. I didn't feel anger standing there. I felt mostly just tired, the good kind of tired, like a man who's finally set down something heavy he'd been carrying for a very long time. My mother is 82 now. Her garden is doing beautifully this year. She's especially proud of a row of dahlias she started from seed. I still go by most Sundays. Sometimes I fix something around the house. Sometimes we just sit on that porch swing my father built, and she tells me stories about the 3rd graders she taught 40 years ago, half of whom still send her Christmas cards. Walt still lives 2 doors down. We've gotten a lot closer since that morning in March. He comes by my shop sometimes, and I've started teaching him a little woodworking, mostly as thanks for something I don't think I could ever properly repay him for. Carol Ann still checks in on my mother most afternoons, the way she always has, without being asked. I think about that morning often, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clarity I'm grateful for, strange as that might sound. It took nearly losing my mother to finally see what had been sitting in plain sight in my marriage for over 2 decades. Some people show up. Some people manage, quietly and consistently, to be somewhere else. I don't think you can build a life with someone who's always, in the moments that matter most, somewhere else. My mother told me something the week she came home from the hospital, and I think about it more than almost anything else she's ever said to me. "You don't need to punish anyone, Danny," she said. "Life does that on its own, in its own time. All you ever need to do is notice who's standing beside you when it matters and build your life around those people instead." I've tried to live by that since. It's simpler than people think. It's not about revenge, not really, not in the way that word usually gets used. It's about paying attention. It's about finally letting the people who show up mean something and finally letting the people who don't mean a little less. My mother is doing well. My business is doing well. I picked up 2 new clients this spring, a young couple renovating a farmhouse out past the county line, and I find myself whistling in the shop some mornings the way I used to years ago, before I'd forgotten I was a man who whistled. And for the first time in a long while, when I sit down at my own kitchen table in the evening, the quiet in the house feels like peace instead of distance. I had dinner at my mother's place last Sunday. Pot roast, The way she's made it my whole life, potatoes soft enough to mash with a fork, green beans from her own garden. Walt came by afterward with a pie his late wife's recipe, still perfecting it, he says, though it tasted just fine to me. We sat out on that porch swing until the sky went the color of a ripe peach, and my mother told a story about a boy in her third-grade class back in 1988 who'd once tried to convince her that his homework had been eaten by a possum he kept as a secret pet, and Walt laughed so hard he had to set his coffee down. It was, by any measure, an ordinary evening. But I've come to understand that ordinary evenings, the kind where nobody's checking a clock or waiting for a chance to leave, are worth more than almost anything else a life can offer. I don't carry bitterness about any of it anymore, not really. I think, if anything, I carry gratitude, strange as that sounds. It took something almost unbearable to finally show me a truth I'd been avoiding for years, and I'd rather have learned it the hard way than never learned it at all. Some people spend their whole lives married to someone who was never really there, and they never get the clarity to see it clearly enough to change course. I got that clarity, even though it cost me, and I've tried every day since to be worthy of it. That's the whole story. There wasn't a dramatic reveal, no shouting match on a courthouse lawn, no viral confrontation. Just a son who finally saw clearly, a mother who taught him, one more time, what it means to show up, and a quiet decision to build the rest of his life around the people who already knew how.